didn't do this before officially. The University of Silesia and Professor Anja Brosch and Kurt Maciek and Katarzyna Markol for having invited me in this period as a visiting professor. It has been a really interesting experience for me, and I'm glad really of being here and to give to you some advice about my research actually and what I'm doing in my researches in Italy and a bit abroad. What I thought to present to you today is something a bit different from what we have discussed until this moment in the other lessons, regular lessons, we could say, because it's somehow is one of the most general level of my reflection at the moment in thematics and the topics of cultural heritage, and it is about, as you see in the title of this conference, Heritage Studies and Cultural Mediation, how ICH, Intangible Cultural Heritage, can help to manage cultural controversies. So you grasped in the previous lectures that I work a lot on conflict. My researches are very often centered around conflicts about cultural heritage, conflicts about environment, and the way that communities work on heritagizations, both of the habitat, of the environment, then of cultural issues. But here, what I'm going to show to you are some of the main debates that actually are discussed around the world about the topic and the possibility that cultural heritage is not only an issue for being on our own, for being rooted on our territories, for becoming a community, for rooting somehow our identity, but also for dialoguing and exchanging and sharing with other peoples and to eventually reduce the possibility of conflict, which is, as you see very easy, a very, I can say, sharp political point, because we can use cultural heritage as a tool for peace building. Maybe one of the first great areas of debate about cultural heritage and opposition of culture has been the idea of cultural property. You know that it is a real open question. Maybe one of the most important areas of the debate where this has happened was in the area of the Native American people, but not only. Generally, we had a lot of debates also in the areas occupied by, for example, Aboriginal indigenous population, like in Australia or in New Zealand, and, for example, for the communities that are hidden in the Amazon forest, that are committed to defend ourselves from the attack and from the erosion somehow of the main culture, the mainstream cultures, the Occidental cultures. And one of the most important questions that have been isolated for the first time in the debates that Native American people have engaged with the federal estates in the United States were exactly the question of who's the owner of the property, of the cultural issues that we were managing before and after have been somehow, I can say, erased or stolen by the colonizer. And this has been a huge debate because you know that at the moment, after the official decolonization of the areas of Native American people, and even after the definite decolonization of the areas of, for example, the minorities of the Amazon, South America, people start to discuss what about of recovering these cultural properties, and also these properties at all. I mean, territories, areas, regions. You know, the first very hard area of discussion has been a question which could be apparently a very casual or minimal one, but in reality it has been the first step for a great process of recovery of cultural ownership for this population, and was several procedures and trials, so-called reburial trials. What was the reburial trials? Were legal trial, in which Native American people were asking for coming back to the territories where their ancestors have been buried. You understand? Buried, it means that people that is in a place under the earth, and population is on the contrary out there from this territory, pushed away, and they ask for saying that they have the right of being in contact with their ancestors. And look at this point, they use in a very sharply way the tools of the Universal Declaration of Rights. You see how much is important the use of global tools, the use of global frameworks of signification. Because there is an article, the article that speak about of identity and of the right of roots for people in the Universal Declaration of Rights, that is also extended to the link with his proper ancestors. People has the right to be in contact with his proper ancestors, have the right to come back where his ancestors are buried. So they start to use this instrument, which is paradoxically a small element of a big question about recovery of cultural heritage and cultural properties, and even territorial properties, and they say, okay, we need to come back. We have been pushed in the reserves, in the enclosures where people of Native American population has been thrown during the colonization, and we need to come back to our villages where our ancestors have been buried. And in some cases, and it is interesting because it's a huge political point, that one, in some cases they won. They won these trials, very well placed, and they used the support of anthropologists for winning these trials, for reburial, for bring back our ancestors to the territories, or for rediscovering the burials of their ancestors. After this first step, it starts, as you can easily understand, a lot of other parts of a recovery operation that is a plan of recovery for Native American peoples, that after the civil rights movement on the 60s occupied all the 70s and 80s and even the 90s in some federal state of USA, and they started to recuperate, as you see, territories, indigenous intellectual property rights, the question of what is a native culture, what is about native culture, who we are, and how we can manage and conserve and take care of our cultural property. You see, and this is a very, it's a very polemical point. In this moment there were many conflicts. There is a very famous trials which has been described in a very sharply way in a text of Clifford, whose I don't remember the title in American. In Italy is the pure fruit are going mad, which is a part of the poetry of a poet, a native poet, which say that who says that there is no pure and pure fruit, all is mixed and anytime transformed in the flow of cultures. And in this volume of Clifford, Marcus Clifford, which is one of the most important critical anthropologists in the United States, actually, and globally, he described this important trial in which a particular tribe of Native America, who was placed in Connecticut, started an accusation against the state of Connecticut, asking for their territories, in the name of the fact they were the heirs, the strict direct heirs of these cultural and territorial properties. And he described all the complex way of discussion and of definition of identity. The lawyers that supported the defense of the federal state of Connecticut say, who demonstrate to us that you are really the heirs of this particular Native American? You have not strange hat on your head, you are dressed like us. Why you are saying that you are yet the heirs of the, I don't know, Machu Picchu tribe or Pied Noir tribe, or I don't remember. It seems to me that was Pied Noir, a particular tribe of the area of the north of the United States at the border with Canada. And he says, and they answer, we have not to demonstrate by being dressed like ancient Indians that we are Indians, that we are Native Americans. We have to demonstrate with our tradition, our sharing cultures, our way of take care one of the others. It's very interesting because it's a rhetoric of the ownership. It's a rhetoric of the cultural belonging that was at stake somehow. And you see also example of cultural appropriation. The idea, for example, at certain point around the 80s and 90s, it has been also the tendency of using items of the native culture for the white American Anglo-Saxon Presbyterian culture. So, like dresses in the way of Native Americans. This is a sort of cultural appropriation. They use, for example, musics. Have you never seen in the center of big metropolis in Europe some people that play some CDs or dances? That's one. This is cultural appropriation. This is an instrumental and tool use of other culture like a sort of commodity, an object of market somehow, but which is still a way of domesticating and appropriating the culture of the others. It's a sort of post-colonial way of deal with the culture of the others. So, in effect, this debate, which was started with a great fight and discussions of Native American people for recollect their own tribal identity and their own tribal properties, cultural properties, has started a huge debate in the global frameworks around the question of cultural heritage preservation, management, but also cultural property. So here you see, for example, how much it has been exploited not only on the point of view of anthropological and generally ethnological studies, but for example, there are many studies on law, investment law and arbitration. So lawyers that are working very concretely with people, with the population, with tribes, or with the minorities for the recovery and the rebuilding somehow of their own cultural properties, settlement and international cultural heritage disputes. Think about, for example, no more than 2 years ago, the destruction of the Buddhas in Timbuktu, Mali, where you have the sign, very, very efficient and practical sign, that how much cultural heritage has been used as a sign, as a sort of, I can say, a mark of destruction of the culture. So it is a very, very significant way of using, in this case, not dialogue, but destruction for making unuseful, for making available and distracting the very idea of a minority culture, a minority Buddhist enclave in a more majority Islamic enclave. So it's a very sharp use of culture, even of violent cultural gesture, for assessing a position of hegemony on a territory. And there are many contexts, legal contexts, UNESCO one, and I can say we say ONU, but in English is it's inverse. So the international organization of the world on the question of settlement, international cultural heritage disputes, or, for example, the international criminal courts, because we have still in the Haya tribunal the court for the cultural destruction trial, the question that I was just outlining a moment ago, or, for example, West African cultural object at risk. In Mali, in many African contexts, we are at the moment in a very hard moment of risk for cultural heritage, which are at the same time concrete objects, but also practices. People and minorities that cannot still remain in their territories, for example, and doing what they are used to do. Or, for example, here the cultural rights of ethnic minorities in Uganda, another of these areas. For seeing how much this has been pushed at the limit of the debate, in one of the last meetings of UNESCO has been centered on peace and security, ICH, and conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is a huge, enormous area of studies centered around the alternative dispute resolution, possibility of peace building which not pass for entering a war system. With dialogue, with exchanging, with sharing, with co-sharing and co-management of, for example, cultural places and cultural practices. So think about that. One of the last and very, very important meeting in UNESCO has been centered on this kind of topics. So we say heritage and peace building. It is an international center of cultural heritage studies in Newcastle University, who has owned and hosted a big congress on these topics. So you see how much this is one of the first works that has been published, not that, a cultural heritage law book, which is extremely radical and important. One of the great ideas that circulate in this kind of topic is certainly the idea that people could, I can say, share and could participate on cultural heritage, and this participation is at the same time a way of taking care of the cultural heritage. This is a very good point for dialogue and peace building. Why? Because the sharing of for example, of a territory, of an ecological, environmental context, commit and impose to people to have care of them, to have care of this, and to find a way to agree about what we are supposed to do around this territory and what we are interested to do about this cultural practice. So here you see a lot of context in which sharing is caring is a very efficient title of this volume, Openness and Sharing the Cultural Heritage Sector, so that reflect on this idea of dialogue and reconstruction of endangered cultural heritage issues through participation and sharing among people, and at the same time publication of UNESCO and World Heritage sites that speak about reconstruction and recovery as a process of dialogue. In some way, in some case, we assisted to recuperation, for example, of important archaeological or architectural sites, which has been the occasion for dialogue between governments and enclave and minorities in a state, and for being in some way in relationship between separated parties that before were completely one against the other. So it is a very real and important occasion, and a text, a very recent text, is just been edited 1 month before I leave, and we have with another colleague of mine a text inside. There's a very huge text, which is Cultural Heritage Scenarios, financed by an European fund and centered around the idea that cultural heritage. The editors, Simona Pinto and Lauto Zagato, who are professors of the University of Venezia Ca' Foscari, have been worked on a very pivotal idea of cultural heritage as an occasion of dialogue and European cohesion. You see, sapere d'Europa means knowledge of Europe and to knowing Europe, and it is a series of texts in a European fund framework centered on cultural dialogue through cultural heritage issues. So you see how many people. This could be understandable also in a very wide, can I say, context of reflection, which has, on one hand, surely the ICH list, the ICH Convention, UNESCO Convention, so the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, but above all, the reflection that have been generated by a second fundamental convention, which is the Faro Convention on Community of Heritage, on heritage communities, on the value of culture for communities, and which is centered around the notion of participatory conservation. The idea that we cannot conserve and valorize and giving importance to cultural heritage without being this and being together, without doing this together with all a population. We need communities. We cannot think to conserve really, for example, a practice or a knowledge, simply filmmaking this practice, because we are going to have the simple video documentation and trace, sort of video track of this practice. But if we don't work with communities, if heritage communities are not committed and participating to the process of conservation, we are losing. We are going to have only a simple track. We are going to have only a memory, an archive, like a book, a very important one, but it is going to be completely different to conserve and safeguard practices and knowledge. Practices and knowledge need to be lived, need to be practiced by people, living people. And the commitment of communities and the participation is also a way for empowerment of the community itself. So safeguarding becomes through this way an inclusive form of development even for the communities, because participation and commitment and awareness of communities of what they manage, of what they own, of their cultural properties, of what and how much are important the things they do and they have done in the past, become a sort of form of development, of local development, which is extremely inclusive, because people understand that each community, each enclave, each group has its proper cultural ownership. So it becomes something very important and a sort of step ahead, a point of departure for recognition, for admission that even the others, even people that are not part of our enclave, have and share this kind of cultural properties, and they deserve respect and safeguard. So you see many works on this, inclusive social development, like ICH and quality education. Evidently, is a point, a very huge point around how we keep continuing transmitting the knowledge and the practices, and how much this is also a sort of frame in which we can do a good work for conservation and safeguard. A lot of notes and memories of UNESCO meetings for developing safeguarding measures. You know that to safeguard intangible cultural heritage is too much complex. It's much complex, more complex than to conserve tangible cultural heritage. Because you see, there are many traditions even in restoration, as you probably know, that in the sense that, for example, there are some schools that say we have to restore in a very influencing way, we have to rebuild, we have to refresh painters and or I don't know, castles and so on. There are other schools of restoring. There were already in the Roman Empire these schools, this idea about restoration, but they say, for example, not, we have only to conserve the cultural heritage as, in this case, the tangible cultural heritage as we found, for preserving for other destructions. But nonetheless, it's not so much difficult. I mean, we have to decide on the other side of the of the discussion, but it's not so complicated. When we approach intangible cultural heritage, we have a lot of problem more, because with intangible cultural heritage, first of all, we work with people, and people change, because the people that I'm going to meet today in a territory is not the same that I'm going to meet, or someone for me is going to meet, someone after me is going to meet in 2 decades. I've been in some territories, in some contexts, ethnographic contexts, in which already 2, 3, 4 generations of ethnographers are passed. It's very important to read and to study what the people that have been there as an ethnographer before me has written, sure, but the people was different, and the time are different, and the conditions in which people continue to safeguard some aspect and not safeguard other aspect is dramatically changed. So we have to deal here with a complete and strongly different way of conserving, you know. It's not a simple artistic of material or architectural conservation. It's not a matter of putting a glass or putting a sort of containment because people going not there to ruin the object. People are moving and do different things, and they have advice what I'm safeguarding. There is even not only one version of the same practice, as you know very well. I mean, when I talk about, for example, artisanal practices, handcraft, with people of a particular village, very often I face with different traditions. One woman say to me one story, one woman say to me another. There is not the truth and the fails. I mean, they are all true. They are different advice on the practice. Think about simply, how do you cook? Well, you are going to describe the same plate in many, many different ways. There is no more true or the other. So we are dealing with a very, very different materials, very, very different witnessing. And this is, I mean, the good and the evil of this profession. This is the very challenging point of being an ethnographer. But in terms of conservation, it's interesting because it shows very well how much heritage is fluid. It's a continuous doing and redoing and reshaping and transforming. And this is very, very useful for thinking about dialogue, because people, if arrive to grasp this concept, that tradition is not something fixed, but it's something that helps people live, to be alive. Tradition is simply what helps us to keep continuing, to have a relationship to the past and a vision for the future. And all people, every different part of the world need the same, need to have a relation to the past and a vision for the future. And this is through their roots and tradition that they elaborate this kind of concepts. So this can be, on the contrary of being opposed identities, can be a real flux of dialogue among people. So you see, for example, intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development, and the very important General Assembly in 2017 of ICOMOS. You know that ICOMOS is the International Center for Museums in the world. Museum not only in the sense of museums, but all the kind of heritage conservation, I mean also Skansen, Eco-Museum and so on. The very important ICOMOS convention, which has been dedicated to heritage and democracy. It's interesting, like a couple of terms, cultural heritage as an element of empowering democracy and dialogue and inclusion. So we have to support cultural diversity as a pathway to multiculturalism and cultural dialogue through many different ways. We could do this through interesting expositions, through reshaping collections. Many collections, you know, museums, there is an important line of studies on this in critical anthropology and critical cultural studies, which have appointed attention to the fact that museums are the product of a nationalist paradigm, a very strong nationalist paradigm. So museums were in the past the containers where a nation represents itself. Sometimes even today they are this, if we thought very attentively to our museums. But in the past it was extremely hard and huge, like a sense for museums to be the representations of the power and of the national regime. And even when the nations were colonial nations, international powers, like for example, let's imagine United Kingdom or French museums, or even some museums in Italy during the period of the colonization of the Horn of Africa and so on. We have, or in Germany, for example, about Congo and other areas that were possessed by the German powers, we have a sort of representation in the museum, in the collection, of the others like a property, like an object. It's a sort of objectification, reification of the others. This is the approach of the national museums, of the great, Smithsonian collection, or anthropological museums all over the Europe, or Musée de l'Homme in Paris, and so on. At the moment, this idea of the museum like a sort of stamp, of mark of colonial power has been broken, necessarily. And we started to debate a lot on what the new collection about different culture were supposed to become, were supposed to be in the future. And the collection has been changed, and a huge debate on this is becoming the occasion for rethinking the relationship between colonizers and colonized, for example, in a post-colonial debate. So, my museums has become dialogic spaces. You here see, for example, an interesting collection in the museum, the Norwegian Museum in Oslo, which has been, on one hand, centered on the origin of the, Viking histories and the origins of the Nordic population, but that has been used for saying, look, any population in the world has been their proper boats, their traditional way of moving. We have been always in move, always in move. All this collection is centered around the fact that it's not our heritage. What we are showing is something that all over the world has been done, moving and trying to reach other places and trying to discover for curiosity, for necessity, being in need, being in wellness. Anyway, people was moving. It's extremely efficient, like a point, because this changed dramatically the idea of moving because of need only, or moving because of the war, or because the idea that the people who stay well stay in the place is not true. No? The people move anyway, even when they are rich and in wellness, because they are curious, because it is somehow a natural tendency of humanity. So you see how a collection could be rethought, reconceptualized as a way for rediscovering concept, and in this case, inclusive concept. You know that in Norwegian countries, in Scandinavian countries, actually there are many arrives of external people, so it's interesting that even at the level of heritage debate, they work a lot on this one. And on the other side, it is hugely important for the Italian communities, the Ellis Island National Museum of Immigration in New York, in the Ellis Island, which is one of the first museums, maybe the first one of immigration in the United States and generally in the New World, which is extremely interesting because show both the interaction among many different ethnic groups in this enormous immigration to the United States, but also work a lot on how much the ancient story of immigration from the middle of the 19th century until today are similar to the present immigration in every other country of Europe, which is extremely interesting even for talking about the resistance that some places and some nations, like for example Italy, that has been one of the most emigrating nations in the 20th century, actually show a tendency to I can say resist to immigration in its country. It's impressive. It's a very sharp way of criticize this empowering of I can say exclusivism and racism even in former immigrating and emigrating countries. But we have not only to think about sad things when we show and we speak about dialogue through heritage. And what I was interested to do with you today is some example which could be very interesting for you to know, even because I think that it could be interesting also for starting to reflect on Polish immigration too in other countries. This is a very important feast in Italy, which has been nominated along with the other big shoulder machines, ritual machines, like Intangible Cultural Heritage issue in 2013. It is called La Ballata del Giglio, also the dance of the lily feast. The lilies are these enormous obelisks are in wood and papier-mâché, paper worked, and which take place every year in the name of St. Paul in a city which is very close to Naples, Nola. This is a huge feast, very complex one. You know that each one of the ritual objects has a weight of many hundreds of kilos, and under this object there are around 70 or 80 men per time, but they have to change every 3-4 hours because they cannot afford this so great weight in their shoulder, you see. But what I'm suggesting today is to discuss not all this feast. It would be so much complex. It has not been my personal ethnography. It is a very interesting ethnography of my colleague, another professor that work very often with me, but I know very well this feast because often we exchange in some way our ethnographies and our fieldwork. So I went with her to see and to assist and to even for having some different advice, you know. So it's a feast that I know quite enough well, but she is the specialist about. But what I'm interested on explain to you today is not about the feast in Nola, the Italian ceremonials, but that in a very great quarter of New York, of Brooklyn, Williamsburg. You know that Brooklyn is almost a city, a separated city in New York actually, and at the end, inside Brooklyn there is a quarter which is called Williamsburg, where is a great Italian-American community of second, third, fourth generation in some case of immigration, so people that have never been in Italy in some occasion, that have grandfather that came in the United States for the first time. Is that one? And what is extremely interesting is that many people even don't remember if they come from Nola or not. Generally, they are from the south of Italy. They can recognize this, for example, through the name. The name gives an idea of the origin, the regional origin of these families. But nonetheless, for this quarter, the main social and sociability event each year is the celebration of the Giglio feast of San Paolino, St. Catherine Siena Catholic Church. So the St. Catherine Church has been transformed like a center of this Italian-American community, and at the same time they are celebrating also the St. Mary of the Carmel. So they coupled these two great ceremonies, and they rebuilt only one lily, only one of the obelisk, but in metal, very strong and huge one, a very really weight, a great weight on the shoulder. 300 people have to bring the lily during the processions, and they started to have a huge collecting of funds, of ritual dinners. Is a way of representing themselves in the American society. And the very interesting thing is that even the parts of the quarter that is not Italo-American, not because in Williamsburg don't live only Italo-American native people, but even Greek or Latins or other communities of immigrated, of ex-immigrated, now radicated and rooted in the US community, live and have taken these ceremonials like a sort of local feast. They participate. It became the great ceremonials of this quarter. And from the other quarters of New York, people come. In terms of hundreds and hundreds of people, and I'm not speaking about somehow 2 or 3 people that say, okay, let's go today in Williamsburg to see the Lily Feast. No, 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 no. Hundreds and hundreds of people. It became a great, real ceremonial in the city, one of the most important and visible and great cities of the world, completely managed and rethought by a national community. Look at how much it could become an instrument of synthesis and encounter and meeting among different communities. But at the same time, it is a way to represent themselves in the diaspora, because these people kept in contact systematically with the NOLA community. and people from NOLA goes. Think about that. For example, some years ago, a maestro di festa, who is people that organize for each one of these obelisks the group of the activities, so it's some way the master of the feast, was sent in Williamsburg with a group of collatori, of people that bring on our shoulders the lilies, for teaching to people how bring, you know, for knowing the technique. But it's not the only case. Oh, we are studying this systematically with some friends of mine. There are many feasts. We are going to see something more. Someone more. We find many occasions in which people that are dislocated elsewhere in a country rebuild their proper traditions as a way at the same time to recover its proper identity, so for reinforcing and empowering sense of belonging to a community, for making a link with the ancient homeland that they have lived, but at the same time for representing themselves in the context where they live. So it's a way also for dialoguing with other communities. And this is not evidently the only occasion. This is another important, very important, items of this kind of treatment. Italian-American rituals and the building of a migrant identity, because they become somehow not only Italian-American feasts, but migrant feasts. People that are migrants recognize themselves in this diaspora and in the need to rebuild links in the community. And this is a very interesting test that just 2 months ago, a friend of ours, Joseph Shora, who is Joe Shora is the director of the Calandra Institute of Migration Studies in New York, has, it is a fourth generation Italian American. You know, he is the brother of Annabella Shora, who is a very important actress in the movie business actually. And he licensed this text, who's built with faith, that has the synthesis of an enormous work of research that Joe Shora did on Catholic memorial culture in New York City. So, going to look each occasion, each quarter in which in New York, only in New York is one of probably the more multi-ethnic cities of the world and surely of the United States. But anyway, here only monitored all the occasion of the practice and traditional ceremonials in which it's possible to see migrant people that re-elaborate a sort of belonging to their communities and same sense to the New York City. And I say, this is, for example, many images, very interesting one, of Santa Rosalia. Santa Rosalia is a huge fest in Palermo, which is one of the most important feasts in the Sicily, and being the Sicilian community very important in New York City, evidently, they organize each year a rehearsal of this great procession of Santa Rosalia. The statue of Santa Rosalia comes evidently from Italy. It has been, I can say, given in honor of the saint from the Sicilian people to the church where all the migrants from Sicily where normally have their functions, religious functions. And you see, it's interesting also to see the aesthetic ways, you know, they change evidently because they feel also the contact with an aesthetic strand that is evidently the tendency of sociability, aesthetics in US, but anyway, they re-elaborate this kind of religious belonging through the forms of the advisement and of the propaganda and of the sociability in the United States. And this is a very, the most centered on my research, particularly with the population of Molise, or the region in which I work, which has an enormous migration to South America, not only Argentina, but also Brazil, Paraguay, and so on, but in Argentina really so much. Think that actually the population of the Molise is very, very small, and most of the three times of this population is abroad. So they have a Molise outside of Molise, which is extremely greater than the inside Molise. And this is a feast of which a ceremonial which has been studied during many years, which is a very interesting procession for the Corpus Christi, as I can say just for an accent in some conference before. But what I want to put the attention on today is not the feast itself, but the fact that in Argentina, the migration arrived around the first decade, the second decade of the 20th century. So they are all people that are third generation, fourth generation migrants. So very, very far from the beginning of migration, but anyway, they organized, you see, a sort of rehearsal of this ceremony with the small angels put on a pickup, not brought through on the shoulders, as still happened in Campo Basso. They organized. This is the place where there is the regional committee of migrants from Molise in Mar del Plata. Mar del Plata is a very, very great city in the south of Argentina, and they have a particular regional site. They organized each year with a friend of mine, and very, very sharper groups of people that are working in Molise, that are organizing tourism, slow move tourism by walk, and they asked them, and they organized Cammina Molise. This group is called in Italy Let's Up Molise. So let's up and go, go Molise. And they asked at the same way Cammina Molise and La Plata, Argentina. It's interesting, you see, because they want to remake this content. But the very interesting thing is that in these occasions there are not only Italian people or Italian American people, but they receive and join other ethnic components of the migrations that accept and are interested on this kind of cultural activity. So let's have a look on the other side. This is the Chinese community in Milan, and this is evidently the first of New Year's Day in China. You know that is one of the most important ceremonial. The community, the Chinese community in Italy generally, in Tuscany particularly, in Milan particularly, is extremely hard, extremely interesting, and long time curing, because they started to be in Italy at the beginning of the 70s, the first families. Many of them were installed, were organized, they have small factories, small activity, commercial activities, a lot. And there is a part of Milan in which they inhabit above all, not exclusive, it's not a Chinese ghetto, but is more recognizable, is that one, which is Paolo Sarpi, and in the center. And there are many, many Chinese people in the peripheries, evidently in the suburbs of Milan, but in the center there are many people there. And look how much, in this day, the city is Chinese look like. I mean, they really invade the imagery of the city. They really invade the urban spaces. But the thing that I find extremely interesting, if you want, is not the fate of this one-day invasion. Is that the fact that people, Milan, you know, is a very, I can say, up-to-date city, you know, very linked to fashion and living and spectacles and shows and so on, and show business and so on. And people not only accept this presence, but participate. It's becoming increasingly an occasion, for example, for even the most important magazines or commercial galleries for giving visibility to Chinese cultural elements, for organizing artistic and cultural expositions and occasions, for reflecting on Chinese culture and Chinese-Italian dialogue and so on. And I think it is extremely interesting because it has been a progressive path that the community has realized through the work, through being inside the city, through participating to the everyday life of this great city, and at a point they could have this moment of recognition. I think it's a matter of recognition. Chinese people received through this kind of space for them, through this kind of activities, an important recognition in a urban space and in the political and cultural space of this city. It's not only gold what is brilliant, we say, like a proverb in Italy, is not all good. This is, on the other side, another important feast that recently has become celebrated very, very spectacularized in Rome, which is the feast of the Holi, Indian feast of the Holi or Diwali, which has become somehow an happening. So, being a feast in which they use painter for coloring their cells, it has become increasingly an occasion of happy hours. And because of that, this is Rome 2017, so yesterday. And it is because of that I here say, yes, this is an example of dialogue, but it's also the moment in which the cultural dialogue is transforming a cultural item in a commodity, in a market items. As is so suasive and fascinating and finally amazing, because it is amazing, is sure, is becoming, in fact, nor a cultural item, nor a cultural heritage conserved and respected by the local community and known as a cultural heritage, but an occasion for having fun. Well, I'm not Presbyterian in the sense, I'm not contrary to this, but I think we need to reflect to what has been conserved and safeguarded here, and what, on the contrary, has been transformed, is going to be transformed by the use that late modernity and inclusive context do about ceremonies, the holy and the sacred becoming a commodity. Or, at the same time, even in Rome, the constant reference to African context, which is extremely, you know, even very few philological, because it's a general Africa. You know, African festival is all Africa. Africa is enormous, as you know very well. And it's interesting that it's a sort of idea of Africa, sort of Africa sickness, thinking about Africa, longing for. And even this may be somehow a sort of imagery of the others, a new way of objectifying and reificating the others and the other culture and the other cultural heritage. But I try to suggest to you both the well and the negative elements, both the positive and negative elements of this kind of dialogue, of possible dialogue among cultures through cultural heritage. It could be extremely useful. It could be a real alternative dispute resolution tool. It could be a real context in which people meet and confront and compare different ways of surviving and of staying in their place. But it could be also a sort of reappropriation, a new post-colonial way of thinking about the other. So finally, just for saying and to leave to you some questions and some suggestions about discussion, you see just last year in Florence, in March, the G7 ministerial meeting was on culture and was discussing, look at this, we are on the mood, it's protection of artistic and cultural heritage in crisis area. And on the other point, culture as an instrument for dialogue among people. And on the other side, you see one of the series of a volume that the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy are editing last years, centered on the dialogue of cultural traditions like a global perspective. So exactly what we are trying to discuss here today. And I leave you, I solicit you with the last question. Is really intangible cultural heritage of research for dialogue, peace, and inclusion, or more, a way for becoming again and again one against the other?
Okay, thank you very much. Drogie Panie, macie pytania, uwagi, komentarze? Mam nadzieję, że przynajmniej coś zrozumieliście, jak jesteście na angielskim, na poziomie angielskim. Średnio, co? Jeżeli będziecie miały jakieś jeszcze, zainspiruje Was ten temat, zainteresuje, jest nagranie, będziemy mieć to na stronie internetowej, znaczy no, na YouTubie, więc będzie można sobie to ewentualnie odtworzyć, jeżeli byście chciały sobie jakoś tam tą wiedzę utrwalić, to się spożytkować. Czy jakieś uwagi, pytania? Nie?
Maybe just for having fun and for leaving you with something.
To jest już ostatni, to jest już ostatni nasz wykład, znaczy ostatni, przedostatni. Jeżeli kogoś by interesowało jeszcze ten wykład, to ta tematyka, to jeszcze ostatni wykład pani profesor jest jutro, także jakby to może mnie zainteresowało. To nie jest. 13 was tu było? Ile was tu jest? 2, 4, 6, 7, 9 osób było. Nie chyba jeszcze. Pani Justyna? Nie, Fabiusz. Pani. Staroszek, Martyna? Okej, Katarzyna Siedzina? Roxana Plus? Była? Nie była. Kinga Baranin? Okej. Klaudia Baranin? Jest. Martyna? Michała? Justyna? Okej. Motyl? Antyna? Olga?
Just for seeing how it look like at the junior feast in New York. Listen to the mix.
Dziękuję bardzo. A, to właśnie to, o czym Pani mówiła w Nowym Jorku, tak? Jak to jest to, jak oni noszą taką
You see, you heard the music, so they mix completely the musical register of New York, you see, when the saints go marching in.
I to jest właśnie to przemieszanie tej kultury, tego tradycji włoskiej na amerykańskim gruncie, gdzie jest jakby postać świętego włoskiego, a muzyka amerykańska, nie? Więc totalnie macie miszmasz tego dziedzictwa. A to są te obeliski, które oni tam noszą. Nie wiem, czy zrozumiałeś, ale to są ogromne waga tych, to jest to kilkuset kilo i tam po 300 mężczyzn niesie jedno taki obelisk, nie? Więc to jest ogromna rzecz.
Just for having a look, and after I'm going to show you. So there are all American people. Huh?
Is Argentina or?
No, this is in New York.
New York.
So they speak in American.
Widzicie, ile mężczyzn to niesie, nie?
Rambo, you know?
I Rambo, muzyka Rambo, nie? Nie, ja sobie zostawię.
And many of them have never been in Italy, you know? Never. They don't speak Italian, but anyway they feel this strong link to the culture. And it's curious because they speak in American and they give the orders to the people that bring this on the shoulders with the same way of Napolitan people. A bit of Napolitan music. The priests speak in English, in American, just for having a look. Huh? People celebrate the community. Many of them have tattooed the image of San Paolino on the shoulder, on the arms, or on the here, as in Naples. In Nola they did. And that one. Let's see. But there is some ancient people, some old people that sing the traditional songs from Naples.
Italia.
Sì, come t'ha fatto mamma, is dialect, Napolitan dialect.
Czyli jest parę osób, które tam dialektem mówi i coś tam zaśpiewają.
Maybe is one of the second generation, first generation still. I don't think first generation, maybe second generation that remember the language of their parents.
To jest jeszcze jakaś taka duża generacja, która jeszcze coś tam pamięta z tego języka, ale to jest ludzie, którzy tam po prostu nie włoskiego nie znają, nie wie we Włoszech, nie? A i tak noszą to, mało tego się tatuują sobie tego świętego gdzieś na ręce albo na nodze, co mają, nie wiem, podkreślać tą tożsamość, tą więź.
So how much this become a link to the past, to the roots.
I to też jest fajne, jakby taki łącznik z przeszłością, nie? Dlatego ta przeszłość jakby jest dla nich obca.
Just for having a comparison element, this is the feast in Nola. Fantastic things.
Italy.
Yeah, this is in Italy.
A to jest dla porównania właśnie to, co się dzieje w Italii, we Włoszech, nie? Czyli to są te rzeczywiste...
You see, the way they celebrate is the same. I wanted to... Here is a wait just for a moment for seeing when they are working. So it's the same way of processions organized in New York, and this is in Nola, Italy, near Naples. The same ritual objects, the same sense of community, the same sonority around, the sound system. just for having this idea of the comparison and the way in which people use the feast for being in touch with the origin, at the same time to dialogue with the reality where they live actually.
Okay, thank you. Także dziękuję Wam za przybycie.
So many